She was bright, beautiful, and just 21 years old. A psychology student on the dean's list, full of dreams and promise. But when Ramona Moore left her Brooklyn home to grab a quick bite at Burger King, she vanished. For 18 agonizing days, her mother begged police to search. But Ramona wasn't a priority. She was black, she was young, and the NYPD labeled her a runaway. When her body was finally found, naked, in beyond recognition, stuffed under an old ice cream truck, the horror was only just beginning. Ramona hadn't died quickly. She had been tortured for days, tied up, chained, beaten with a hammer, burned with cigarettes, and left to die in unthinkable pain. And the worst part? This tragedy could have been stopped if anyone had listened. What went so terribly wrong? And who were the monsters behind it? Stay with me because Ramona's story deserves to be heard. It was a quiet spring evening in Carnegie, Brooklyn, April 24th, 2003. Ramona Moore had spent the day the way that she usually did, studying hard, helping around the house, and chatting with her mother, Ellie Carmichael. Ramona wasn't the type to disappear. She was shy, studious, and respectful. A junior at Hunter College, she just registered for summer classes and was working part-time as a receptionist. Her dreams were big: research, psychology, making a difference. Her world was small and safe. That night, around 7 p.m., Ramona grabbed her jacket and told her mama she was stepping out.
She left home and she told me that she was going to the local Burger King.
She never came home. At first, Ellie wasn't worried. Maybe Ramona ran into a friend. But by 9 p.m., when Ramona still wasn't back and hadn't called, Ellie's gut twisted. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She called Ramona's friend Gary, the one who often hung out with her. Gary said he had seen Ramona earlier but hadn't heard from her since. Is here. The officers worked quickly, pulling back the blankets and plastic. What they found was devastating. A young woman's body curled up and stuffed under the truck like trash.
Okay, we're gonna pull the body out, I guess, I'll give you a hand.
It was Ramona. Her face was unrecognizable, so battered and broken that even Ellie couldn't identify her own daughter. They would later have to use dental records to confirm what Ellie already knew in her bones. Ramona had been missing for 18 days, but the horror was only beginning to unfold. Detectives moved fast now. Finally, the case that had been brushed off as a runaway was suddenly high priority. The moment they saw the state of Ramona's body, they knew this wasn't just a murder.
3.5.
It looks like it may have been smashed in. Her whole face is gone.
Bruises, cuts, and deep wounds covered every inch of her. She had been tortured. Detective Mike Heinrichs, one of NYPD's most decorated officers, would later say it was the worst case of his entire career.
This was the worst case I've ever been involved in.
The neighborhood watched in shock as police began to piece together what little they had. They found no immediate clues, no ID, no weapon, no clear sign of who had done this, but they did have that strange phone call. The caller had mentioned a house on Snyder Avenue, a place where he said he heard screams. Police zeroed in on that lead. What they found was chilling. Just a few steps from where Ramona's body had been dumped stood an abandoned, crumbling house. Once inside, detectives knew it was the kind of place where no good ever happened. Drug paraphernalia, trash, and signs that people had been squatting there. Why had it taken 18 days and a mother's chilling? Just a few steps from where Ramona's body had been dumped stood an abandoned, crumbling house. Once inside, detectives knew it was the kind of place where no good ever happened. Drug paraphernalia, trash, and signs that people had been squatting there. Why had it taken 18 days and a mother's unrelenting fight before police even started looking? Could Ramona have been saved? At Ramona's memorial service, her community came together in grief and anger. Friends, neighbors, and classmates packed the small church, remembering a girl who was kind, hardworking, and full of life. Her dad said,
Ramona was an angel, and she was just getting started.
Now, only now was Ramona's case gaining attention. And as the media started filming her family, her uncle had this to say.
We pay taxes like everybody else. Why is there a double standard?
The weight of that truth hung heavy in the air. But for Ellie, grief alone wasn't enough. She wanted justice for Ramona and for every black family who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or devalued by the very people sworn to protect them.
Yeah, we have a petition.
Oh yes, I'm ready to sign.
As the candles burned and prayers were whispered, Ellie made a quiet vow to her daughter's memory. This would not be the end. She would fight for Ramona until her last breath. The house on Snyder girl escaped. Her story was almost too horrific to believe. She told police she'd been kidnapped off the street, dragged into the house, tied to a chair, and SA'd over and over again.
They put a pillowcase over my head and they just pushed me on the floor and took the strings and tied up my ankles and my arms.
She sat in that dark basement, terrified and alone. But the worst part is what her captors said.
They said that if I didn't cooperate, then I would end up like the girl that they had last night because she was feisty and they had to kill her.
The dead girl was Ramona. The survivor's escape was miraculous. After her captors passed out drunk, she bit through the tape on her mouth, wiggled free from her bindings, and ran upstairs. Desperate for help, she woke up Troy Hendrick's grandmother, who was asleep in her room. But the woman shockingly refused to help. The girl kept going. She ran into the street, barefoot and bruised, and finally made it to safety. Her testimony was a breakthrough, but detectives still needed more. That's when Ramondo Jack came forward, guilt eating him alive.
It started to bother me. Every time I go to sleep, I'll see the girl's face.
Raimondo told a story that left even hardened detectives shaken. Weeks earlier, he'd stopped by his childhood friend Troy Hendrick's house. Troy and his friend Kason Pearson were acting strange. They told Raimondo they had snatched a girl off the street and were messing her up in the basement.
He was telling me a whole bunch of nonsense about he had some girl in the basement, but I didn't believe it. Then after that, he said, every time I go to sleep, I'll see the girl's face.
Raimondo told a story that left even hardened detectives shaken. Weeks earlier, he'd stopped by his childhood friend Troy Hendrick's house. Troy and his friend Kason Pearson were acting strange. They told Raimondo they had snatched a girl off the street and were messing her up in the basement.
He was telling me a whole bunch of nonsense about he had some girl in the basement, but I didn't believe it. Then after that, he said, say what's up.
Still in disbelief, Raimondo was led into the basement. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ramona Moore, tied to a chair, barely conscious.
And she was bleeding from the middle of her face, and one of her eyes was swollen.
Troy and Kason forced her to speak. Then, in a moment that still breaks the heart, Ramona looked at Raimondo with swollen eyes and whispered, "I think he's a nice guy. I believe he's going to help her." Tied to a chair, barely conscious.
And she was bleeding from the middle of her face, and one of her eyes was swollen.
Troy and Kason forced her to speak. Then, in a moment that still breaks the heart, Ramona looked at Raimondo with swollen eyes and whispered, "I think he's a nice guy. I believe he's going to help me." But Raimondo didn't help. He left, too scared to act. He told himself the police wouldn't protect him, so he kept his mouth shut until the guilt became unbearable. When he saw the news about the 15-year-old survivor, Raimondo realized the girl he had seen had been Ramona, and that she was now dead. He finally broke down and told the police everything. Detectives rushed back to the Snyder Avenue house, this time with a search warrant. Inside, they found their proof: duct tape chains, shoelaces, blood stains on the basement floor, posters of naked women plastered across the walls like some sick decoration. A room built Ramona, and that she was now dead. He finally broke down and told the police everything. Detectives rushed back to the Snyder Avenue house, this time with a search warrant. Inside, they found their proof: duct tape chains, shoelaces, blood stains on the basement floor, posters of naked women plastered across the walls like some sick decoration. A room built for cruelty. The horror was undeniable. Ramona had been held there like a prisoner of war. Everything pointed to long hours of restraint, abuse, and unimaginable pain. There were signs of struggle everywhere, scratches on the walls, and spots of blood that told a silent story of someone fighting with everything she had. This wasn't random violence. It was cold, calculated, and relentless. Her killers had enjoyed what they did. For the detectives standing in that basement, there was no doubt left. Justice wasn't just needed. It was demanded. It didn't take long for police to put faces to the horror. Troy Hendricks and Kason Pearson, two young men from the neighborhood, both members of the Bloods gang. Troy Hendricks was just 22. He lived in the very house on Snyder Avenue where Ramona had been held captive. He shared it with his grandmother upstairs while his basement became his lair. Kason Pearson was 21, a little quieter but just as dangerous. He moved between apartments, often staying with Troy, always keeping close to his gang ties. These two weren't just criminals, they were predators. And their crime? It wasn't spontaneous rage, it was deliberate. But while Troy was quickly arrested, caught after a tense standoff at his own home, Kason vanished. A manhunt was launched. Police combed Brooklyn and Queens, hunting for any trace of Kason Pearson. They hit addresses, questioned friends, and shook every branch of his family tree, but he was slippery. For weeks, it seemed he had disappeared into thin air. And while the Kason barricaded himself in a bedroom, clutching a knife, daring officers to shoot him. They did.
Police in Yonkers say 21-year-old Kason Pearson was shot in the leg and arrested during a Wednesday morning raid at a Yonkers apartment.
You want to say anything?
I'm not a How about that?
But the evidence said otherwise. Inside the courtroom, things were just as explosive. On the very first day of testimony, while the 15-year-old survivor bravely told her story, chaos erupted. Kason, hiding a homemade plexiglass shank, lunged at his own defense attorney, stabbing him in the chin. It was pandemonium, controlled only after several officers wrestled the two men to the ground. The judge had no choice but to declare a mistrial, sending the case back to square one. Ramona Moore's murder wasn't just a tragedy, it was a betrayal. A betrayal not only by the two men who tortured and killed her, but by the very system that was supposed to protect her. From the moment Ramona disappeared, her mother, Ellie Carmichael, did everything right. That sentence cut deep, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Ramona's case was pushed aside, filed away like it didn't matter. 18 days passed before the police even began to investigate seriously. By then it was too late. Ramona was already gone. And Ellie knew, in her bones, why. Her daughter was black. Ramona's murder forced a painful conversation in Brooklyn, a conversation about race, bias, and who gets to be seen as a real victim. At protests and community meetings, people spoke out what they had felt for years. If Ramona had been white, the police would have acted faster. Ellie pointed to another case that happened just weeks before Ramona disappeared. A white woman named Svetlana Aronov went missing on the Upper East Side. Within hours, the NYPD launched a massive search. The pain was unbearable, but Ellie was not about to sit quietly. She filed a civil rights lawsuit against the NYPD, accusing them of systemic bias against black. Face was fully opened, agreed that something had gone wrong.
The most frustrating thing is while you're pulling your hair out of your head looking for the girl, these people directly across the street saw and know that a girl's being tied up and held in the fucking basement. And nobody calls the police.
No one helped Ramona. She was kidnapped from a Burger King in broad daylight, and no one helped. Troy's friend saw her in a way that still haunts him every night. He didn't call the police. And Raymondo might not even be the most shocking bit here. Maybe most shocking of all was Troy Hendricks' own mother. She lived upstairs while Ramona was being tortured below. And still, she insisted she knew nothing, claiming her grandson never made noise and that she was kept in the dark. Even when the 15-year-old survivor begged her for help, she shut the door.
I asked her if she could please help me and if she could open up the door, and she said no.
So the police then spoke to Troy's grandma.
What do you think happened with the girl that woke you up?
I don't know what happened to her.
Did anybody ever tell you what happened to her?
No. They don't tell me much around here. They protect me. They keep me in the dark.
Ramona Moore should have been protected. She should have been saved. And although the justice system eventually caught her killers, it's clear the system failed her long before that. When Troy Hendricks and Kaysen Pearson finally stood trial for Ramona Moore's murder, the courtroom was tense. The prosecution laid out the case with brutal clarity. Ramona, a 21-year-old college student, had been abducted, held captive for days, essayed,